Gender identity and sexuality are complex terms. Their meanings are varied, nuanced, and ever-changing. In this episode, I have invited 3 colleagues to explore myths around gender identity and sexuality. The views and opinions represented in this episode are personal to the individual contributors. Through conversations, the complexity of these terms is further explored and discussed. As you watch this episode, I'd encourage you to reflect upon your own thoughts and perspectives around these myths and what gender identity and sexuality mean to you.
Hi, my name's Kyle, pronouns they, them. I'm a consultant in HIV and sexual health at Barts Health, and I am a member of the Decolonising Contraception collective, which addresses sexual health needs for people of colour in the UK, and I'm also a trustee for Stonewall.
Hi, I'm Ethan Wilson. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a medical student at the University of Glasgow and a trans health educator.
Hi, my name's Duncan Shrewsbury. My pronouns are he, him. I am a queer gay academic GP in Brighton. Where to begin? I often wonder if that sort of question arises from a fundamental misunderstanding of the difference between sex and gender. And I think there's quite a few examples, even in the legal framework around gender recognition, where that is used interchangeably incorrectly. But even if you think of biological sex, there are examples in nature, in biology, where things don't necessarily fall in the binary of male or female. A good example being, for example, people with Klinefelter's or Turner syndrome, where some of the fundamental characteristics or attributes of XXXY are challenged.
I think, it's interesting because you said biological sex and you did that automatically. And I think it's, we talk about sex and gender as if they are different. And actually, if we really think about it, they're the same thing. Like they're not different things. And actually sex, so Judith Butler is this, feminist writer, and they talk about how sex and gender are actually the same thing, and it's all performed, it's all social. And our ideas about what we think about men or women come from interactions. It's different in different societies and it changes. And that isn't quite the same thing as someone's genitals and their reproductive ability, which is the only biological part. I think people often get fixated on, for example, chromosomes as something. We literally do not test people's chromosomes unless we're looking for a specific genetic disorder, right? So actually we have no idea what someone's chromosome. I'm sure most of us don't know whether we definitely have whatever chromosomes we're expected to have based on what we looked like when we were born. And actually what happens in our society is someone looks at your genitals as a baby and says, you're this or you're this. So actually it turns into, this is what sex becomes, right? But I think when we really think about our interactions in a day-to-day basis, it's more about how we're perceived and what that means. And yes, in Western society, we're perceived, and I say Western society, but actually this encompasses most of the world. We group people into 2 sexes and we say you're either male or female. And then it turns into man, woman, and there are expectations on what you're going to do and how you're going to reproduce and where it goes from there. And I mean, I always approach things from, so I'm doing a master's in post-colonial studies at the moment. I tend to approach things from this point of view. And we do know that actually in most societies across the world for hundreds and thousands of years, there haven't been just 2 genders. So that is more of a Western idea that's been imposed across the world. And it doesn't mean to say that the majority of people in those societies were not binarized. And yes, there have always been kind of this idea of there being a man and a woman, but actually they were a lot more open to the idea that you could have 3rd, 4th, or even 5th genders and other things within that. So definitely not a two system thing.
I thought you drawing on Judith Butler and the sort of the similarity or sameness of sex and biology and gender very interesting, because I think that's what we see happen in some of the rhetoric around, and some of the fairly anti-trans rhetoric that we see prevalent in mainstream and social media. For example, a movement of people describing themselves as an adult female or the owner of a cervix, and that somehow confirming or conflating with a biological notion of absolute womanhood, but we know that there are many women who don't have cervixes for lots of different reasons. And likewise, there are men who don't have penises, and sometimes that is because of some inbuilt biological thing, and sometimes it's because of other things. But the conflation of personhood with a particular biological trait is, I think, really, really harmful. It completely misses the complexity of being a human being, all in the quest of being angry and exclusive.
I also think, when you start pinning things down into that biological sense, it almost, to me, goes against the whole point of the feminist movement, which is not wanting to be defined by just your body and your bodily functions. So that as an argument, to me, feels dangerous. And it also feels dangerous when you have a tick box exercise of what defines, I say womanhood, but also, manhood, when you're saying, okay, so you have to have a certain balance of hormones, you have to have a certain type of chromosome, you have to have a certain type of genitalia, you have to be able to reproduce, you have to be able to, menstruate or have boobs, whatever it is, those things. And it feels really dangerous when you're saying all of that needs to be fulfilled, And as you say, because there are many situations where lots of those things don't happen, people don't suddenly lose their womanhood when they go through menopause. People don't suddenly lose it if they realize that they're not able to have children naturally. I think things don't end, your womanhood doesn't end when you stop being able to have children or when you stop menstruating, for example. So we realize that sex and gender actually is so much more than that. That's where we realize it's our interaction with other people in society. And that's why I really do believe that sex gender is a social construct and biological sex doesn't exist, personally.
That's fair. And also hormones, if you're going to throw that all into the mix as well, makes life even more complicated if you look at sports. Mm-hmm. So a trans woman wants to compete in the women's category, but the testosterone levels might be too high, but actually a cis woman with the exact same testosterone levels, which are maybe slightly higher than the normal range, even though normal is what is normal, said cis woman is going to be praised for she's so lucky, born with this extra ability to be stronger and quicker, but it's the exact same. And actually what you're saying is the problem is that one woman is trans and the other one is cis. It has nothing to do with the hormones, which all comes back to the fact that the problem is within society.
I mean, we've also, again, binarized hormones in that way and decided that testosterone has to be an innately masculine hormone and estrogen is the opposite. And we know that, cis men, cis women, biological men and women can have varying degrees of those hormones. And I mean, when you look, for example, at testosterone and the normal range of that, it varies massively. And also it doesn't always kind of translate into the things that we might expect it to. So actually lower levels of testosterone don't always mean that someone is going to lack the masculine qualities that we think, or people that, for example, boost it don't always suddenly have, an improvement in the things that they want.
I liked your point, Carl, about how for centuries or millennia, different cultures have had different notions of personhood rather than a binary category of male or female. I recognise in myself that my sense of gender identity and gender expression change from day to day, and I think the same can probably be said for most people. There are some days where you feel a bit more masculine and other days less so, and that could be because of things you do or people that you're with or things that you see or the way that you feel. And I think the notion that it is completely fixed and rigid, let alone binary, is probably harmful because it stops us from thinking critically about all of the different things that influence who we are and how we feel, and also how we are influencing others, especially children, in the way that we socialise them into certain roles and expectations.
it's almost like a restriction and experiencing the fullness of being a human being, because you're in this box and you're told, well, this is how, you know, you should behave. And then I think it's also interesting because you're saying, you know, some days you could feel more masculine and some days you could feel more feminine, for example, but even though that as a concept is going to be different in a different society. You know, what you define as masculine, for example, is what fits into where we are now in this context, right? But it could be something completely different. And, you know, so that's why, you know, people talk about like divine energies, for example. And again, that's going to be different in different time periods in different countries.
But I mean, it is really hard to like, what does it mean to feel masculine, to feel feminine? Mostly I just feel tired personally, but you know, but I think if we think specifically about defining how many sexes there are, okay, typically we think you have male, you have female, you have XX, you have XY, but you've already said yourself there's genetic variation. So then what about the entire intersex community? There will be those who will lump being intersex with being trans, which for some intersex people, that may well be their identity. For some, it's not. I can't speak on their behalf, not my place to do so, not right to do so, but I think it just shows that you can't, there's not just two boxes for everything. And I think people typically want to make it as easy as that, and it's not as easy as that. And it's, I can't remember how you just phrased it, but like the fullness of the human experience. No one ever tells us just how wonderful that can actually be and how much there is to experience. And I think that's really sad.
To bring a personal element to exemplify that, when I was talking to Ria this morning, part of the conversation was about my journey to where I am now with my self-identity and my queerness, and how being authentic in all spheres of your life makes a difference. And I'm not quite sure how I came up with this analogy, but the words that came to mind was that when I feel aligned, you know, maybe it's because I've got my favourite pair of heels on, or some new sparkly nail varnish or something like that. It's not that I feel that that ticks the right box for me to, it's just that there's something inside me that just makes me feel like my heart sings, and I just feel a bit more me and a bit more liberated, and it's difficult to put that into words, and it's difficult to help people who are not receptive or open to thinking about things in that sort of way.
We should all chase that feeling, because that sounds really nice.
But also, you know, you said like people who are not receptive to it, and I think the question is, so why, you know, why is it that people feel this way? And I would say one approach would be that sometimes people feel under attack, and sometimes people feel like almost we're trying to dismiss concepts of maleness, femaleness altogether. And actually, I think we wouldn't be having any of these conversations if we thought that it wasn't important. Actually, it comes from the idea that, you know, gender and our gender expressions are important to us, but all we're saying is that it doesn't have to be as rigid as we think, you know? It
feels quite saddening when you see some of the rhetoric that there is, you know, prevalent, and the anger behind it feels, like you say, that it comes from a place of feeling threatened. And I always try to understand where something's coming from, first seek to understand, then to be understood. What is it that's threatening that individual or that community? And it's interesting because I think some of the arguments that people have articulated far better than I ever can, in terms of actually some of the fundamental principles that underpin feminism. And I appreciate it may seem odd that me as who I identify as a man, you know, commenting on feminism, but looking from the literature and feminist scholars, some of the principles that underpin the fundamental basics of feminism are, you know, it's the same as being supportive and open to people who are marginalised in the trans community and other communities as well. Not deprioritising the experience of women and womanhood, not negating or deprioritising some of the atrocities that as a species we inflict on each other, but also being open to the fact that there are other people who share those experiences too.
Yeah, and the point is it's those experiences are under this kind of cis heterosexual patriarchy, and everyone is suffering from that, including cis heterosexual men. But the point is people don't often realize that. So it's one group of people saying, oh, well, we feel under attack by these people, and these people are taking more space away from us, or, you know, where our voices are getting lost. But actually, by fighting with each other, we're forgetting what the bigger enemy is, if that's the right word.
It does. It dilutes any argument, and I think I hadn't really appreciated that until I came out as trans and started medically transitioning, and then, okay, great for me, now I can look in the mirror and see myself as I feel on the inside, and that's great. For me, my identity does mostly align with your typical, what would have been cis-het man had I not had to do the whole transitioning part of it. But then, actually, I don't know that I have still figured out where my identity, because my identity and how I find myself changes based on where I am and who I'm with. So if I'm in the gym, we very much have to play up the dude bro, gym bro, very minimal words, grunting. That just happens. Even though I try to avoid it, it happens. But then if I'm in spaces with all my LGBT friends, I'm just a lot more, I don't know, I'm going to say flamboyant. People tell me I'm camp. People assume that I'm gay because I'm very aware that I talk with my hands. And I'm like, yes. But I think somewhere there's a middle ground. But because there's all these boxes that we're ticking and labels putting on things, like, I haven't actually found my middle ground yet. And that big sigh that you had earlier, I relate to, and that's how it all feels. Just a big sigh.
Do you feel as a trans man that having medically transitioned, that there is kind of a pressure that society puts on you to behave in a certain way now, so that you can't, for example, be camp or be flamboyant, or, yeah?
Yeah, like the whole, what do they call it, like toxic masculinity. So technically right now I'm not on testosterone because I'm waiting for fertility preservation, because at some point I want a tiny human, which means hormones are doing what hormones are doing, and I'm feeling all the emotions quite often, and I'm like sitting there thinking I'm gonna cry because I'm rewatching sad films, and then I'm thinking, oh, but I can't do that. Society tells me I can't do that, and then I think, oh, it's too late, the tears have happened anyway, and it's just like the pressure to fit into that mold that actually, no, if you then extrapolate that out, that's why there's problems with men's mental health and suicide rates, because men are constantly told, they can't do the whole feeling thing.
If it's any consolation, I cry at most things, especially Disney. Although I do hesitate when I describe myself. Do I say I'm a queer man or a cis man? I don't always know, and I think my hesitance is not, do I know who I am inside? Yes, I do, but what group am I claiming to represent in what I'm about to say through that identification? Do I feel that I sufficiently represent or am queer to talk about being a queer man, or because I don't think that I understand from lived experience the perspective of somebody who might be non-binary, because I haven't identified as that or you know had those shared experiences. But equally, I sure as hell know that I'm not a typical cisgendered man, and yes, so it's odd. It's odd when you start playing around with what box am I trying to tick here through what you're about.
Which just shows why it's so difficult for trans patients, for example, in medicine or in healthcare, trying to be understood. And again, it turns into something much more performative, and we say, well, gender is performative, but actually it means it shouldn't be restricted. And so it becomes something where, well, if you want to transition, you have to prove yourself in certain ways. So then you're having to jump through hoops of kind of like, okay, you've now done this and you've now done this, and you're presenting yourself in this way for so long before you're even going to get to that point. And, you know, I think there's generally a misunderstanding that people think that, well, if you want to become, if you're trans, you are going to want to fully go completely and do this, and you want to change your genitals and change your body and take hormones and do all these things. And actually sometimes people just want to do some of that, or, you know, again, it's a very personal thing, and that's why really what we have at the moment is not fit for purpose.
I think your point about gender being seen as performative is possibly something that underpins some of the hateful rhetoric around trans people in women's spaces. You don't tend to hear the similar rhetoric around people who are trans in men's spaces, as if we own it. I fully understand concerns about violence, but I don't understand the conflation that somehow being trans means that you're more likely to be violent towards other people. I think, I don't know where that's come from, and I think it's hateful. But interestingly, from my experience as a queer cis man, you know, wearing heels or sequins or nail varnish or lipstick in the male's toilet, you know, even in Brighton, that is considered, you know, to be a bit of a hub for the LGBT community. Even in Brighton, I've been physically assaulted for being in what somebody thought was the wrong toilet, where, for all intents and purposes, okay, I've got some purple hair, but I'm 6 foot something, and I've got fairly broad shoulders, and I'm standing at a urinal, so, you know, the indicators are there that there is stuff that qualifies me to belong in that space. And it's interesting how, through tokens of performativity, it is policed by not necessarily the dominant group, but perhaps the most aggressive group.
I mean, and you also just, you know, like you say, that a lot of the fear or hatred results in this vilification of trans people, as if trans people are these kind of boogie men, because if we talk about trans women, they're still men, because that's how they're perceived. It's men invading women's spaces. So we straight away have this idea that they're not women. And then beyond that, then you have this idea that they're hiding in spaces ready to attack women, you know. And it almost, for me, again, it feels like a reflection, or not necessarily a reflection, but there's a parallel with the way that certain immigrant groups are demonized in that same way. So we have this idea of Pakistani Muslim men in the Midlands grooming young white girls. And, you know, actually, when we look at it, you have this same victim that's used as this trope. So you have the innocent white girl who's going to the toilet, who's going to be attacked by a trans woman, or in the same way you have innocent white girls who are going to be attacked by immigrant men. And it's the same story that's being recycled, yet we don't seem to see it.
And I think one of the commonalities between those stories is that sense of safety and threat. And I think that actually speaks to wider issues around misogyny and the patriarchy. You know, if our society, if other societies weren't so imbalanced towards women and oppressive towards women and progress towards equality, then I don't think the same level of fear would exist. And interestingly, so the same fear around that is often the same fear that patients who are trans who I've worked with have described to me, but also I can identify, having had my own experiences of assault in toilets, is actually sometimes your decision making is, where am I less likely to get decked? You know, if I go into that door, or do I commit the social faux pas of using the accessible toilet? Safety and a vulnerability and a fear around violence underpins all of those shared experiences. But what seems to be neglected is the fact it's that misogyny and patriarchy that is feeding it, that is the source of all of that.
And where is the concern for that trans person, like you say, who's sitting there and deciding, well, where am I going to be safest to go actually? And in the majority of cases, that's what we're dealing with. You know, we're not dealing with people who are pretending, and, you know, people will always abuse any system, but whatever that is going to be the smallest percentage of people. The majority of people are actually just trying to live their lives and be authentically themselves and be safe.
And ideally just go and have a wee when they need to go and have a wee, preferably. But it's funny if you think about it, if you use people's own logic against them, if they're concerned about trans women being in women's spaces because that's men and women, where's the concern for trans masculine people using the male toilets? Are they not concerned that trans masculine people, because by their logic, who are therefore still women, are going to be attacked? Because like, I'm still kind of terrified going into the men's toilets. It does still make me nervous, and I'm well aware I do have that privilege of passing, problematic concept, whatever, as a white male. So, albeit a short one. So, but really, there's no reason, unless you know me, to think, why would I be concerned for my safety going in? But I still am. It's ingrained in me.
Gender isn't fixed. But of course, that is with the caveat of, well, it depends entirely what we mean when we're talking about gender. And you mentioned earlier on, in terms of the word gender itself is pretty useless unless you're in the specific context of it. Gender identity, gender expression. I certainly know that my sense of gender identity, although it is on the masculine end of the spectrum somewhere, it's constantly changing and constantly challenged partly by me and partly by how other people may accept my tokens of gender expression. So I don't think for anybody that is a fixed or binary notion. And I think the idea that you can potentially hold simultaneous characteristics is perhaps something that needs to be brought into conversation a little bit more. You know, I've got some nice pearlescent sparkly nail varnish on today. It's a bit subtle for me. Usually I go a little more garish. And it's interesting, the thought process behind choosing what colour is very much what public transport am I going on, with what cities am I visiting, where am I going to feel safe, and that kind of stuff. So there's an element of my sense of gender identity expression that is policed through fear.
And, it's probably helpful maybe to speak about our own experiences and maybe some other terms as well. So for example, you know, you're saying your gender is fixed, but your gender is fixed, you identify as a man, but your gender expression, for example, changes on a day-to-day basis, or your feelings about gender, or how you feel can change. And you know, there are different terms that we use. So for example, I identify as non-binary or gender non-conforming, and I just kind of don't feel like I fit within anything, and I'm quite happy outside of it, and I'm happy to again feel masculine some days, feminine other days, and I can express that however I want without again having to feel like, because I'm non-binary, I again have to present in an androgynous way. I can just be me, and I just feel like a human and a person and being me. Then, you know, so in a sense I have changed my gender. It could be, for some people I identify as trans because I was born male, but now identify as non-binary. Some people would disagree. I don't really mind, I'm non-binary or gender non-conforming. Then you also can have gender fluid people who, for example, can just change how they feel and how they present on a day-to-day basis, and that may include pronouns, that may include gender expressions, and it can include different things. And then we have trans people, and maybe that could be something that you could, you know.
I would identify as a binary trans, like mostly now I tend to just kind of avoid mentioning the trans part, depending what space I'm in. And okay, yes, I do a lot around trans health education, so actually within the world of education and medicine, I lasted 4 weeks before I came out, when I planned to not be out at med school. Well done me. But actually, for me, my identity before I came out, ignoring the reflective part that if we go back to how I felt as a teenager using hindsight and all those great things, before I came out, I definitely identified very much as your stereotypical feminine girly girl. Like it was the dresses, and it was the cute shoes, and it was the long dyed red hair and curls, and you know, it was very much the stereotypical feminine girly girl. And actually my identity now, for me, if I were to try and fit it into some sort of mold, would be closest to your typical binary masculine man, which then gives the two issues of I'm well aware that I don't like the fact that actually perpetuates the stereotype and the view that that is what men must be, and therefore if you're a trans man, you come out and you medically transition and present as masculine, you must do, and then I think, okay, so maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't. And I'm like, but that is where I feel like I fit. But then I'm in spaces with all my LGBT friends who are all convinced that I'm gay, and it's like, I kind of feel pressure to be a bit more, and it just, oh my God, it's so exhausting.
I think you made a really interesting point about being in the presence of your LGBT friends, and some of them feeling like a need to pigeonhole you into, oh, therefore you must be a gay man or something like that. And I think that highlights that a difficulty with sitting with the uncertainty and complexity of all of these concepts is shared throughout multiple communities. I don't think it's a them and us. I don't think it's everybody who's not queer versus everybody who doesn't fit. I think it's very much a, gosh, actually, anybody who's human might struggle with some of these concepts because actually they're pretty complicated, and a lot of things are complicated when you realise that it, you know, that doesn't equal that, and that's not a conflation or an accurate conflation.
I think we have to be forgiving, we have to be understanding, we have to allow people to grow and change the same way we all have. I'm sure we, as you know, maybe 10 years ago didn't have the level of understanding that we do now. And I think a lot of issue comes from people just being scared to either ask questions or to make a mistake. And actually, you know, the main thing for me just comes down to respect and respecting people and who they are and how they identify, how they like to be called, and that's all it comes to. And you can ask questions and you can grow from that. And if you make a mistake, it's not going to be the end of the world. You apologize and you just move on and you learn from it, you know. I think that would be, yeah, one of the biggest points I would like to get out there.
Everything about identity is like, I mean, we're talking about gender identity, but actually everything about a person's identity. When we talked about needing to go for a wee and trying to decide what toilet do I feel safe using, and what was it you said about like the social faux pas of using the accessible toilet? So I don't necessarily openly identify as a disabled person stroke person with disabilities, but if you want to take it purely by legal definition, can I tick the boxes on a form that yes, I can, thanks to long-term chronic health issues and what have you. So actually, there are times when that would just make my life so much easier, but because I am not visibly disabled per what society thinks, I feel really self-conscious going and using the accessible toilet, which actually would make my life a lot easier at times, thank you gastro issues. But actually, why has everything got to be so difficult? It's all about how society perceives you, when identity is so individual to everyone, it's so multifaceted, and everything, there's a word I want for it, and I don't know what the word is, where it's all like interconnected and influences each other, like each part of your identity. None of it can be siloed. It all, there is a word for that, but I don't know what the word is.
Complicated and messy.
Not what I was going for, but also not wrong. Being trans means having the surgery, because that's always the first question, isn't it? Have you had the surgery? Well, which one? I had my tonsils out when I was a toddler. Like, that was my first surgery, does that count?
I think it shows society's view of what gender is, the fact that people get very fixated on surgery and body parts and what that means, yeah.
If you want surgery, great. If you don't, also great. If you're kind of stuck in the middle and actually maybe you don't want surgery but health benefits, you might need a surgery, whether it's gender affirming or otherwise, that's just part of life. So I mean, for me, yes, I very much needed top surgery, and I cried the first time I saw my chest after top surgery, and it was wonderful. And I'm still terrified to be outdoors without my shirt on, despite the fact that is what I wanted, because I'm now very conscious that my scars will out me as trans. And actually within medicine, when we were doing Let's Learn to Use the Stethoscope, not in first year because that was on Zoom, so that doesn't count, but when we actually got into in-person teaching, they were going to teach us, okay, let's do listening to breath sounds. Typically, the guys in the group volunteer and it's tops off, let's listen. And I panicked because my group didn't know that I am trans, and therefore I was like, oh my God, I am about to have 8 peers and my tutor. This could be really awkward. I don't know any of their views. What if one of them potentially is transphobic? I would like to hope not in the world of medicine, but sadly that doesn't always happen. So, you know, that was like totally not even the question. But, you know, for me, I needed that surgery to feel comfortable in myself. But it's a very personal thing.
Yeah. I mean, you used the term earlier, so you said like a medical transition. So again, probably help to think about definitions. So you've got like medical transitioning, there's social transitioning, which maybe we've been speaking about a little bit more, which might be, for example, changing how you dress or how you're presenting yourself or your pronouns or whatever that be. And then you've got legal transitioning, which is the other thing you were talking about in terms of getting a gender recognition certificate, so something
I knew it had a proper name
on paper that tells you you are this, you know. And so there are various levels to it. And so yes, society gets really fixed on surgery and things like that is the main goal. And actually, some people, for example, may just do a social transition, and that's enough for them. You know, it doesn't need to be more than that. Some people may do, you know. And again, you've used the term saying top surgery. So like, again, so we would say top surgery above and bottom surgery for below. And again, people may have different views on what they want to do and what's going to be affirming for them and what is comfortable for them, what they may want to do at a point, and it has to be just something very personal. And the point is, it's also no one else's business.
Yes, yes. It is a little odd how much of our society seems to be very preoccupied by what's in somebody else's underpants. It is utterly bizarre. From my experience of working with trans patients, the proportion of people who wish to go through surgical intervention is quite small, I think. And then, like you say, there are different degrees to that people wish to go through. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that by and large, there's a huge amount of variation, and the notion that being trans equals having surgery is nonsense.
I think even within the trans community, the discourse around surgeries is problematic. I can't speak for those in the trans feminine circle and surgeries they undergo, because obviously I have absolutely no experience bar what a couple of friends have said when they've gone through their recovery. But thinking particularly about transmasculine genital surgeries, the fact so much of the discourse comes around of, it's not a real penis though. Is the outcome of the surgery going to be good enough? And is it going to look right? Is it going to function properly? And I get that everyone has their own personal wants for what they want to achieve out of surgery. But I think at the very basic level, if you think of a transmasculine person having, say, phalloplasty and having a penis constructed from skin from, say, their arm, because I think that's typically what is preferred. And then they have whatever I love the name of it, and I can't remember the name of it, but the erectile the device, it's got
pump that's got a squeezy thing that's hidden into the
scrotum,
or something.
But the name of it is just so on brand for what it does, and I can't remember. But actually, there are cis men who will have the exact same implant because of erectile dysfunction issues, and actually, it's literally the same thing. But for a transmasculine person to have it, that's not real. It literally is just addressing, I guess, a little physiological bit that's missing. It doesn't matter what the reason for that is, it's still doing the same thing. So even within the community, I find some of the discourse is quite interesting, which honestly surprised me. Like, I get we focus a lot on out with the community, people looking in and their assumptions and pressures, but even within it, and you think, haven't we got enough to deal with without the infighting amongst ourselves about, but this procedure is better than that procedure? And actually, no, it's about what's right for an individual person, whether you have any procedure or not.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the big myths and one of the big things that people say, and probably within the aromantic community people get really bugged about. And And again, it's kind of understanding more about like the wider human experience, like we were saying. So there are lots of different types of relationships, first of all, and people who are aromantic, for example, may just not want or have a need or feel very, like they gain very much from a romantic relationship, but it doesn't mean that they don't have loving relationships with many other people in their lives in a different way, including friendships or familial.
My understanding is that the term can mean different things to different people, and I think, like you say, the importance is perhaps on what that individual identifies as a meaningful, nurturing relationship, and whether you get that nourishment and nurturing from love of one form or another, how you express or receive that love can be, it is very individual and particular, but it is for everybody, and it should be respected as such.
And obviously, you know, people who are aromantic can also have sex and have sexual relationships with people, and those things don't always coincide. So you could be aromantic and asexual, or you could just be aromantic but have sexual relationships with people, and the same vice versa.
So, okay, fine, you've got like the LGBTQIA+ spectrum, but being aromantic is a spectrum that could go from actually no kind of romantic relationship to some they might. Actually, maybe if they form a close bond and companionship, then they do, which one of my friends is aromantic, and actually for them, what really matters is feeling that connection and closeness to a person, and if they have that, they might develop a romantic relationship, but they might not. But that doesn't invalidate the closeness. I think the thing that really bothers me with this as a myth is the fact that it puts so much weighting on the most important relationship being a romantic relationship.
The sexual relationship.
And you know, it's interesting because often aromantic or asexual people sometimes find like they're excluded from the LGBTQ community or from queerness overall. And if we really think about queerness in everything that it is, in terms of being anything that's non-heteronormative, that doesn't equal heterosexual, non-heteronormative, right? It's very queer. It's actually saying, I don't need to live my life by these rules. I don't need to be defined by another person or made into a whole person by being with another person. You know, that's truly freeing yourself of that heteronormative patriarchy. So I love it.
And it's interesting how it's reflected in the everyday language that we use. When I say we in the general sense, you know, such as my other half. Well, actually, you look pretty complete. So, yeah.
I even recently came across something on social media where they were talking about couples privilege and actually how society is built around couples. And I'd kind of vaguely had ideas about this, but never really heard it put in these concrete terms. And I was like, it's just so true. You know, it is so true that, you know, we do have this idea that that is the goal, that this is the place to go to, and then the world builds itself around it. We build our relationships around it. This is what we do, as if, like you say, as if it's the most important thing, when it's not. And there's so much more that we can get from life. With for example, with communities, you know, I think we often, that's something we are probably quite good at within queer spaces, is building communities. And maybe that does come from the fact that we, you know, in some ways are outside of that heteronormative structure, so we try to build something more. But I think it's also, again, for me, a symptom of kind of capitalist society where we move into this real individual, and so we're seeking something and we think we can only find it in one person. But actually, no, we can find it through the richness of all the relationships we have with people in life.
And the richness of the full human experience.
So there's a very limited view of what time looks like and how we move through life. And I think really we live in a much more exciting time because of the fact that kind of the LGBT movement has moved so far forward and people are able to kind of be themselves a bit more in many societies. I think it's really exciting to see what the future will be for queer people. We have the ability to carve out whatever we want in the future. I guess heteronormative would refer to the idea that you have man and woman, they get together, have a romantic relationship, and they have children, and there's this kind of set way that things go. And nothing that fits outside of that exists, and obviously we're adding the term normal into there, so this is the normal. Everything outside of that is abnormal. And actually, the reason why we talk about kind of heteronormativity is because that's how society is built, and that's certainly how Western society has been running for thousands of years. And then we often add extra things onto it, so we now add cis onto there as well, and that's obviously adding the gendered element, because sometimes people feel heteronormative, for example, refers just to sexuality in relationships, and actually the cis adds this idea of kind of recognizing that society again works on this binarized gender way, and actually it's saying that cis heteronormativity refers to the fact that you have cis man, cis woman, and they get together. And then I've been using the term patriarchy as well, which, it just refers to the fact that we know that generally cis men have always been in charge of things, and society again is structured around the fact that we have cis men at the top and everyone kind of falls into line below that.
Everywhere you look in society and social structures, there are hierarchies, and those hierarchies put some people at a particular disadvantage and some people at a natural advantage, and it is generally, like you say, the cisgendered white man at the side of the advantage, and generally women and people of colour and people from other marginalised groups who are disadvantaged by those structures. The terminology itself is a bit problematic, because I think it speaks to a preoccupation with performative sex acts, and that is what a relationship is. And again, as we mentioned with other terminology, I think it can mean different things to different people, and for some people it might mean that the experience of sexual intercourse is not something that they're interested in, not something that they derive pleasure from, and not something that they find meaningful in their lives. For other people, it might mean that they engage with it in certain contexts to a certain extent, but it might be limited, or it might mean something different to them in the context of their relationship. But I imagine there's also other aspects to that spectrum that I haven't quite captured in my example.
I think what would be interesting is to think about how, as society, how we define sex. And again, I think we define sex as penis into vagina. That's what we define sex as. And then if we move to gay men, for example, even some gay men, for example, say sex has to be anal sex and other things aren't sex, And, sex, again, it's like, it really, when we think about it, it's penis focused. That's what it is. It's focused around the penis. But actually, sex can be so much more than that. But then where someone draws a line is foreplay sex. At which point, from starting to touch someone, does something become sex? And then again, you've got self-pleasure as part of that. And I think what I would say in terms of asexual people is being asexual may not always mean that you don't have sexual pleasure or experience sexual pleasure in some way. And everyone, again, will experience that in their own personal way. And, the whole point with a lot of these myths is it seems to put people into boxes and say, well, if you are asexual, this is how you must behave. And actually, as we've talked about with gender and sexuality, these things are fluid and can change from time to time. And you may identify as asexual, but it shouldn't limit your sexual experiences. It just shows it's interesting because, again, within our heteronormative patriarchal society, we can talk about sex when it is kind of, penis, vagina sex, but when it's anything else, it's seen as, deviant, and we shouldn't talk about it, or it's much more shameful. And it's really interesting that, that encompasses kind of queer sex acts, but it also seems to encompass self-pleasure, which could be one of the most liberating things not for everyone, but for lots of people, that's a very liberating thing. But it's so mired up with shame, and I
think there's a lot of shame that polices not just the conversation around different aspects of identity, relationship, and sexual experience, but stifles the self-exploration and identification and celebration of that.
Yeah, there's some great stuff out there about kind of the erotic as a form of protest and pleasure as a form of activism, and I think it's very, very true. And I think, it's something that's within our power and within our ability to do, and we shouldn't feel restricted by all these structures that tell us how we should behave.
That's fair. I recently did some work with a local peds emergency medicine junior doctor around the fact that they don't really have a bit in their history taking of where they try and understand a person's gender identity. So if they're faced with a trans child, is there anything else maybe they should be aware of? But they obviously do ask about sex, but it doesn't seem to be that there's many follow-on conversations of what does that actually mean to the young person in front of them.
It comes back to the fact that society still is focused on sex as long as it appears within this place. And again, that's what asexuality moves beyond and is saying, I'm not going to be restricted by any ideas about sex. I don't have to do this thing, whether it's for pleasure, whether it's for reproduction. This is not something I have to participate in,
It does seem to still focus on reproduction.
So I use they, them pronouns. I've only kind of officially started using them probably in the last few years. And it was, to be honest, I don't think pronouns matter to me so much. I'm who I am. For me, it was a decision because I wanted to push the conversation forward, and I felt like it was a good conversation starter. I felt like there were lots of people in my life who probably weren't aware, or maybe had never met people who were non-binary or gender non-conforming. And again, it just opens that up for discussion and gets people thinking a little bit more about their preconceived ideas about gender for everyone that they look at in life. So that was kind of my personal reason for doing it. But there are lots of, actually, I say I started using those pronouns, but I initially started using he, they, almost as a transition into it, where I was like, okay, if some people want to use they pronouns, they can. If some people want to use he, they can. And my biggest thing was that I didn't want people who I already knew in my life to be fumbling over the words and getting nervous and stressed about it. So that's why I kind of started like that. And again, as part of the conversation, I think there should be lots of forgiveness and stuff about it. We live in this society, we've been trained in a certain way, and we are going to make mistakes, and that happens. But going back to the myth, people can use all different types of pronouns, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't relate to whether you're, non-binary or not. And, I always look at Jonathan Van Ness, who says, you can call me, he, she, they, whatever, I don't really care. And, but there are other people who are very fixed about it. And again, the key is asking someone, what pronouns do you go by? What do you like to be called by? And you use that in and out of their presence, and you do it because you respect them and respect, their identity.
I think drawing on the example of Jonathan Van Ness is quite beautiful for a number of reasons. One, he's a fantastic human being, or they are a fantastic human being. But two, it also illustrates that significance of their pronouns to them is in a completely different context compared to, say, somebody else who might feel quite dysphoric about different aspects of their identity or very insecure. And there's a certain degree of security and almost, I guess you would say, privilege, although sometimes that term can be a bit weaponized, from that position of I am who I am, you can call me whatever you like, that's fine. And then there are other people for whom that will take on quite a different significance. And it's interesting, just in the time that we've had together when we've been talking, I've noticed a few times I hesitate with how I describe my self-identity, and I have been awkward about it for months, years, probably years. And I probably will still continue to say that I'm pretty sure that I identify as being within the physical embodiment of a man, but I don't identify as being particularly masculine. And for some people that might represent non-binaryism to them. It doesn't to me, but I recognise that there is a cloudiness around that. It's not clear, and it's not even clear to me. But the pronouns thing, to me, speaks of a few different notions that touch on safety. And I wonder if that may play a part in the way that I cling to the he, him, or that aspect of my identity, possibly.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, I completely get it. And I think similarly for me, I felt scared to tell people that. And it was only because I had colleagues who were encouraging and who said, of course, like, you should do this and we should make this a thing. And I decided to do it. But it does get tiring, I think, sometimes being a queer person and you've come out already in so many ways, and you just get tired of coming out and having to defend and describe and explain yourself to people. So it just turns into another thing where you're like, can I be bothered to do that? And do I want to invite these conversations or these criticisms or everything else? But I think, the key with it is a personal thing, and actually the pronoun isn't the most important thing, it's how you feel. And, well, anyway, I hope that you find your kind of understanding and your way with it. And as long as I hope that you don't feel too restricted by the people around you, and I hope that you can kind of, and hopefully you'll understand yourself better as time goes on.
Well, I live by the motto that we're always only ever becoming ourselves. And so that journey of self-exploration and understanding is never truly complete.
But on a practical level, going back to what you were saying about the fact the importance is the respect, is using the pronouns correctly for whoever is in front of you, whether they are actually there or not. That's the important bit. If I think back to my undergrad, I took what I thought was a very simple motion to student council that basically said, whenever you are running meetings that are led by the student union and you introduce yourselves with your names, can we also just use pronouns, please and thank you. I thought that's an easy win, tick. We debated that for half an hour, and I didn't understand why it was such a big debate. And there was one student at the back of the theatre that said, I don't understand why I should have to share my pronouns. That's for me, that's not for you. And I'm thinking, okay, how do I talk about you in a sentence that I'm not going to keep using your name because I don't even know your name. So I did know their name, and I did know that he used he, him pronouns. So naturally, I spent the entire half hour using she, her pronouns, and he very quickly lost his temper, and I just had to say, that's exactly my point, because you're uncomfortable, because those are not your pronouns. It's not about you. It's about us knowing how to refer to you. It's a simple bit of respect. I think especially, like you said, for people that use multiple pronouns, whether it's I'm trying out a different pronoun, whether it's actually I'm still questioning my identity, whether actually it's gender fluidity and I identify more with one pronoun, but actually as the day progresses, do you know what? No, I identify more with another one. It's important to respect any and all pronouns that a person uses.
I think it's helpful for everybody as well, though, not just whether you're on a particular journey with your sense of gender identity, but for wider sort of populations, because there are people who may not necessarily possess the physical attributes that you would stereotype as masculine or feminine, and sometimes that uncertainty can lead to getting things wrong in formal situations, in social situations. And if there's a really simple way of avoiding that, isn't that something that we should be trying out?
I find it hilarious when I come out to people and tell them that I'm trans. Suddenly it becomes, oh yes, so Ethan, she was doing, I'm like, what? Where did this come from? But completely taking gender identity and everything out of the question, what about people who don't have English as a first language? And in whatever their first language may be, there's different pronoun structure within language.
Words, yeah.
So actually, for them moving to English, it really helps them to understand what your pronouns are, to know how to talk about and to you. And I have heard people whose first language has not been English, I don't recall what it was, talking about their son, happily using she, her pronouns, because they're just, this is a pronoun, this is my child, I am talking about my child, therefore this is a grammatically correct sentence. And it is, but to us, with what we're used to based on societal norms, it sounds weird. because
That is a very, very good point.
It's interesting because, like say, because Western languages are very kind of gendered languages, especially the Romance languages as we know, but actually across the world it's just not like that. And there are lots of languages that don't have male and female pronouns, they just have pronouns, you know. Mandarin, for example, you know, but there are many. They generally don't even have he, she, which, just shows that maybe in some societies it was less important if it, you know, is language a reflection of society.
Thank you for watching this Meaningful Conversations episode. We hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to see more videos in this series, then please like and subscribe to this channel and hit the bell so you can get notified of new videos as they're posted. We look forward to seeing you in the next one.